Okay, so next up is our second technical presentation of the day. It is being given by Tim Jefferies Fisher, right? Fisher Jeffs, sorry. So we're really honored to have him here today. He gave a presentation several years ago at the last NEWSDR at Tufts University. Today's presentation by Tim is on 5G New Radio U. And Houston, we have a problem here. So without further ado, let us all warmly welcome Tim Fisher Jeffs.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Tim Fisher Jeffs. I work for MediaTek. As Alex said, I gave a presentation a couple of years ago at the same workshop. At the time, I was working on 5G standardization of the actual channel coding aspect of 5G, which ended up as LDPC codes and polar codes. Well, I've moved on from there, and I'm now doing 5G NRU specification. So I'll start the talk with a little bit of context as to what that actually means, because maybe a few of you haven't heard of what that actually is. And then I'll go a little bit more into why it's important, sort of lay some groundwork. Then I'm going to dive relatively fast and deep into a particular aspect of the actual regulations around the use of the spectrum that we're allowed in NRU, which is actually showing the same spectrum as Wi-Fi. And then I will highlight a problem that I have discovered along the way, which, hence the corny title, Houston, we have a problem here. Anyway, I'm not going to give too much away. Hopefully you'll be as surprised as I was when I first discovered it. But first, a little anecdotal story, which, well, I found amusing. Maybe you will too. But about 7 or 8 years ago, I was having lunch with my colleagues, one of which is over there. And yeah, it was just at the local cafe. And one of the guys at the table is now the VP of sales. At the time, he was doing technical marketing for us, sort of traveling all over the world. And this was one of the rare occasions he was actually in the office. And so I remarked at the time, well, LTE is massively similar to Wi-Fi. You know, 802.11 is also OFDM, as is LTE. But clearly, personal opinion, maybe, LTE was the superior technology. You know, it was designed for long distance and for short range. It was designed for mobility. It's got MIMO. It can handle multipath. It can handle simultaneous communication. It can do frequency reuse of one. You know, it was a very long list of why LTE is better, and you could argue that some of it was contentious. Anyway, so I posed the challenge. It's like, well, what if APs adopted LTE as the technology of choice rather than 802.11 as a standard? And I tried to sell this hard. I tried. You know, LTE in the ISM band. Why not? You no need for multiple receivers. You get all the benefits of LTE, and I listed the same controversial list of, why it was a great idea. Anyway, he shot me down. Told me it was crazy. Why would you reinstall that massive base of technology that's been there for sort of decades or more? Anyway, 2 years later, Qualcomm started making noises about the same thing, except they started making it in standardization meetings. And I sent my colleague the email. I told you so. Of course I did. We're still friends, but if only I had sold it harder. Anyway, 3 years later, 3GPP actually standardized LTE in release 13, which happened in the first quarter of 2016, and it was called LAA. So I learned 2 lessons that day, or that year, I guess. One is if you have a revolutionary idea, you stick to it, you sell it, you make waves until everyone's listening. Otherwise, It's just another idea to put in the box. Secondly, engineers are terrible at selling. Or maybe this engineer is terrible at selling. My mate, who's now VP of sales, he's also an engineer, but clearly he's good at sales. So what is NRU? Well, NRU is NR in the unlicensed spectrum above 5 gigahertz. So it's a 5G technology. So this is what everyone calls 5G. This is what's standardized by 3GPP. NR stands for new radio, by the way, and NRU is new radio in the unlicensed band. So it'll include the 5 gigahertz band and any 6 gigahertz band when that's finally released, if it does actually happen. And eventually, it'll also include millimeter wave at 60 gigahertz. Importantly, it doesn't include the 2.4 gigahertz band for ISM. It's too narrow and it's too crowded. So it's a follow-on to LTE in the unlicensed band, which 3GPP calls LTE-LAA, License Assisted Access. Now, this is not to be confused with LTE-U. I know that's confusing. We've got NRU, so why wouldn't it be LTE-U? LTE-U is actually a proprietary standard. It does exist, but it's not standardized by 3GPP. Neither is Multifier or CBRS, which are also loosely based on LTE. They are not 3GPP standards. So NRU is the official follow-on to LAA. It inherits all of the details of NR. So anything that you see in NR will also exist in NRU. But it does use a licensed NR carrier to carry some of the control information, which is termed non-standalone NR. There is a standalone version of NRU planned. I believe it's happening in release 17, which is the next release. LAA, incidentally, operates in exactly the same way. It has a licensed carrier. There was intentions to have a standalone version of LAA, but that just never came to fruition. So why is it important? Well, spectrum is a finite natural resource, as is gold and uranium, but it's controlled by regional regulators. Now, maybe a lot of you don't realize this, but it takes many, many years to open up a new band to technology. So the ISM bands that were opened up, the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz bands, were opened up long before Wi-Fi came along. We're talking 25 years ago. People got together and thought it would be a great idea to open up this chunk of spectrum for everyone to use. They set some limits on what was allowed, some spectrum masks and all the rest of it. No one had even considered wireless LAN at that point. Maybe some people had considered some wireless microphones at best at that point. But 25 years ago was the last chunk of spectrum that was allocated for us to use freely, provided we stick within certain criteria. But wireless data consumption is on a complete tear at the moment. We just can't keep up with demand. Carriers are crying out for more spectrum. They're willing to pay billions of dollars to get their hands on 20 megahertz of spectrum. So they're very keen to offload wherever they can. And here's some graphs that were pulled from Cisco's latest VNI, which they publish, I believe, once or twice a year, just to demonstrate to you where they believe the industry is going for wireless communications. And it's just astounding. I mean, the number of exabytes per month that we're all consuming is on track to hit, 46% year-on-year growth. And a significant chunk of that, if you look at the second graph, can anybody see my mouse? No. Oh, interestingly, I can't see my mouse. Anyway, the graph on the bottom is showing how much of it is carried over wireless carriers. Specifically, the Wi-Fi and mobile offload to Wi-Fi is just incredible. Presently, all of the data offload that is done to Wi-Fi. There are no other networks out there yet that can do that. So the ISM band is comparatively a large chunk of spectrum. And what makes it extremely attractive is it's at a low frequency. I know that sounds crazy, it's a low frequency, like it's 5 gigahertz. I mean, that used to be a high frequency, that's now a low frequency. And as I said, when the spectrum was opened up, it was a high frequency. So technologies didn't necessarily enable the kind of things that we can do today with the spectrum. We've had incredible advances in process node, state-of-the-art receiver architectures, and we've been able to create very competitive, very cheap, small devices that can access the spectrum that really weren't considered even feasible 20 years ago when the spectrum was opened up. So that's kind of impressive if you think about it from a forward-thinking point of view. But there's more to come. 25 years later, we're back here again. The FCC and ETSI are now considering, well, I wouldn't even say they're considering anymore, they're actively engaging in opening up a massive chunk of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band. FCC specifically is considering all the way from 5.925 to 7.125 gigahertz. And currently they're at the NPRM stage, which is Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, is what it stands for. And a decision on that is expected next year. Whilst ETSI is currently considering just the lower portion of that band, still a considerable chunk of spectrum when you compare it to what's currently available in the ISM bands. But they're a little slower, so they're at the feasibility stage. And best case decision is 2021. So the problem with the 6 gigahertz band, which is exactly the same problem, by the way, that they have in the 5 gigahertz band, is they're incumbents. There's no free spectrum anywhere in the world. It's a valuable natural resource and it's finite. So the operators in the 5 gigahertz band were radars. So if you know anything about Wi-Fi, you'll know there's this concept of DFS. You have to look for radar, and if you see radar, you have to avoid it. They are the primary user of the band, and you have to get out of their way as opposed to them getting out of your way. Well, the same is true in the 6 gigahertz band, except they're a different set of incumbents. So the band is basically split into Uni 5, Uni 6, Uni 7, and Uni 8. And they span different allocations. But the ETSI is only considering Uni 5, which is the 5.925 to 6.425 gigahertz. But all of those bands come with incumbents where they're in the Uni 5 band, they're microwave point-to-point links. They're fixed services. Uni 6 is mobile services, so it's exclusively mobile. And then Uni 7 is, again, fixed services, but it's satellite communications. And Uni 8 is your satellite radios. So all of this is going to come with a coordination aspect of who's allowed to use the frequency and when. And it's going to be done via a database. And the unfortunate name for this database acronym is AFC. It's not automatic frequency control, it's automatic frequency coordination. But it's going to be a database where you'll request access to a particular frequency, and you'll either be granted it or you'll be denied it. So what's the big deal? Well, LTE-LAA, when it was first introduced by Qualcomm, not MediaTek, was hugely controversial. The Wi-Fi companies just dug their heels in. They kind of made the assumption that the ISM spectrum was exclusively for Wi-Fi. But they failed really to recognize that there were a lot of other incumbents in the space too. Bluetooth, Zigbee, proprietary microphones, and basically anybody out there that is compliant to the regulations can use it. So you don't even necessarily know who's out there who's using it, that there are other people. The biggest problem, I guess, is that IEEE had particular influence over the regulators themselves. What's resulted is an extremely acrimonious battle between 3GPP and IEEE as two separate standard organizations. And they're fighting over, well, absolutely anything that they can. Energy detection, preamble detection, short channel signaling, how ACNAC is fed back and adjusts contention windows, what constitutes evidence of success, whether you're allowed to pause your transmission or not. Anything's up for grabs and they'll fight for it. The fact is that the spectrum is provided for anyone to use, provided you adhere to the regulations. And that's what 3GPP is trying to do. IEEE might disagree with that. So who's involved in NRU, particularly? Well, the short answer is everyone in wireless. Literally, there are monthly submissions from every single one of these companies without fail. I have to go through a list of over 30 documents a month of various proposals of just one tiny aspect of NRU that I'm working on. The more complicated answer really is, well, it's ETSI, 3GPP, IEEE, and the FCC. So what could possibly go wrong? I mean, on one hand, you've got IEEE, which decided entirely by votes. You go to the meeting, you get a vote. 3GPP, on the other hand, is entirely driven by consensus. There's no voting. If you want to get something involved, so if you want to get something accepted in the standard, you have to go around and convince everybody else that it's the best idea. And once there's no objections, it gets adopted. You can imagine an IEEE person going to a 3GPP meeting or a 3GPP person going to an IEEE meeting. They'd just be like a complete fish out of water. It was like, what on earth is going on here? Well, ETSI and FCC are government agencies, so well, no need to say more there. This might surprise you. ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standard Institute, is the most influential organization in the ISM band. And you'd say, wait, what? What about the FCC? Surely it's the FCC. Well, no. Because ETSI mandates certain procedures to ensure fair sharing. And they write down specific procedures that you have to follow. For example, energy detection, preamble detection, listen before talk procedures. Whereas the FCC just mandates that you have to do fair sharing. It doesn't tell you how. It just says you have to share fairly. But no standards body, and that means IEEE or 3GPP, wants to do multiple ways to achieve the same goal, fair sharing. So instead, they default to adhering to the ETSI specifications everywhere because they don't want to have a separate geography, i.e. the US, with their own set of specs. So essentially what's happening is ETSI is regulating American usage, even though it's governed by the FCC. And then the rest of the world follows ETSI. So if you want to have influence over the ISM band, you attend ETSI. So the thing about the FCC, which surprised me, is the FCC will only step in if someone complains. So they mandate fair sharing. If someone isn't fair sharing, the FCC will come down on you, and they'll come down on you hard. No one wants that. So they follow ETSI. So where are we today? Well, as of January this year, we have 32 operators around the world investing in LAA across 21 countries. And there's approximately 20 chipsets from various suppliers that will support various versions of LTE in the unlicensed band. There could be LTEU, there could be LAA, there could be CBRS. MediaTek is one of those providers, I'm happy to say. LTE LAA has been under continuous development since release 13. And you can find it, if you're really interested, you can find it in those specification numbers. NRU will be first standardized in release 16, which is due out the end of this year. Unlike LTE LAA at least, it's going to be actually part of the NR standard, so you'll find it in the 38 series documents. There is extremely strong momentum now for 3GPP to be targeting release 17, where basically NRU is completely absorbed into NR. The operators around the world are pushing extremely hard to get NRU as widely deployed as possible and as quickly as possible. So basically the freight train has left the station and IEEE is heading for a big fight because there's no stopping 3GPP when it gets its momentum. So, the problem. This is, that's the context bit of what NRU is and sort of setting the stage. So now into the more interesting stuff, in my opinion, of, well, what's the problem? Houston, there's a problem here. So we have potentially 3 different goals at play here when it comes to coexistence between systems using the ISM band. So there's one issue with coexistence within the 5 gigahertz ISM band. There's also self-coexistence. So we're talking first about, in A, about coexistence of various differing devices, be it an 3GPP device or an IEEE device. In B, we're talking actually just about devices of the same type coexisting with each other. And then in C, well, what's going to happen in the 6 gigahertz band? Nothing's been written down yet. We're at the stage of we can make anything up we like. So I'm not going to discuss anything here with respect to A, largely because it's quite political, and MediaTek is both an IEEE provider as well as a 3GPP provider. So I'm going to focus on B and C. And really, B is the lessons learned for C. So anything should be fair game for C. We could rewrite the entire regulations if we wanted to. At least that's the viewpoint from 3GPP's point of view. So coexistence really comes down to this word called adaptivity. So adaptivity is defined in the ETSI brands regulations, that's the organization within ETSI, is fundamental to determining fair access in the shared spectrum. And basically, adaptivity boils down to defining the probability of a device gaining clear channel access. Now, you've probably heard this term, listen before talk, LBT. That's the underlying procedure which is defined inside the adaptivity portion of the regulations. And it's actually surprisingly simple, but if you look at trying to analyze a formula to analytically predict what the probability is, I think you find it quite hard, or at least I did. And I mean, maybe you're smarter than me, maybe you can figure it out. But I wrote a stimulator instead to statistically simulate coexistence, at least from what I perceive to be the regulator's point of view. So it simulates all aspects of the adaptivity clauses, that's the right word, within the ETSI regulations. So there's this concept of an FBE device and an LBE device. FBE stands for frame-based equipment and LBE stands for load-based equipment. There's 2 different, sort of very subtly different models. LBE means you can transmit whenever you like. You just have to sense the channel, you do listen before talk. If it's available, you start using it immediately. Whereas frame-based, it's a regular tick. You sense the frame only on this regular tick. If it's available, you get to use it. And that was actually my original remit. That's how come I came to all these results, is I was trying to understand the coexistence model between FBE and LBE. So all aspects of the adaptivity regulation are included. It includes exponential back-off, COT extension through pauses, all the different priority classes. Short control signals are not actually simulated in my adaptivity simulator. They're not really important. And I also don't simulate energy detection thresholds or preamble detection. That's more about how far away the devices are from each other, whether they can hear each other or not. I assume that everyone can hear everybody all of the time. So as many devices as I pile into a particular simulation, they can all hear each other equally well. So I'm really trying to get at the probability of gaining access to the channel. So from an LBE point of view, what is adaptivity? So this diagram is trying to show you, sorry, it's a little small, but it's trying to show you a timing diagram of how listen before talk actually works, okay? So the portion in the top, which is in a hopefully orange color, that is a previous device's transmission, okay? And at some point it's going to end. At the point that it ends, any device that wants to gain access to the channel can start sensing the channel. Well, hopefully it's sensing the channel whilst the other device is also active so that it can time the end of that transmission exactly. So I've drawn four groups of timing here. These relate to the load-based equipment's priority classes. So starting at the top is the highest priority, priority 4, and at the bottom is priority 1. Every single device has to start with what's called a prioritization period, which is a 16 microsecond pause followed by a fixed number of observation slots, which are 9 microseconds each. So those light blue squares are each 9 microseconds. And based on your priority, you either have 1, 3, or 7 fixed observation slots that you have to first listen for. If at any point you sense anything on the channel, you have to stop and start again. So these are fixed observation periods. That's called the prioritization period. This is then followed by what's called a random back-off period. And those are the green squares, the light green little squares, also 9 microseconds each. And how that works is you pull a random number out of a uniform distribution, and that's the number of observation slots that you have to observe for. If you don't see anything on the channel in the entire period, you get to use the channel. So the first 2 timing lines are trying to show the highest priority, the priority 4 device class, the best case and the worst case. So the best case is he pulled a random number of 0, which meant directly after his prioritization period, he can start transmitting. And that's what the dark green portion is. Dark green means that device got the channel because it didn't see anything else on the channel in that actual period of time. The worst case is he drew number 3 out of his random distribution, so he had to wait 3 observation slots before he could grab the channel. So if you group these into 4 chunks, it's best case, worst case for each of the priority classes. And you can see the timing shift between best and worst case, how fast the device managed to get the channel. So out in the field today, 99.99% majority of all devices are LBE devices. And they're all following one of these 4 prioritization class patterns. So how ETSI actually came up with LBE was they took the IEEE regulation, specifically the DCF and EDCAF traffic prioritization procedures, and they copied it into the ETSI specs, sorry, the ETSI regulations. In IEEE, they're defined as background for priority class 1, best effort for priority class 2, video for priority class 3, and voice for priority class 4. It's important to remember, though, that those labels are IEEE labels, not ETSI labels. So you don't have to use voice only on class 4. If you're IEEE, you only have to use voice on class 4. So if you look at this a little closer, you'll notice that class 1, which is the bottom 2 lines, is really not very useful when you're trying to compete with class 3 or class 4 priority devices. Because if you drop down, and I've shown these as little red dotted vertical lines, if you drop down the best and the worst case timing of priority 4 or priority 3, sorry, class 4 or class 3 devices, you'll notice that they always fall within the prioritization period of class 1 devices, which basically means the class 1 device never gets out of its prioritization period before some other device grabs the channel. And that's important because what I didn't tell you is when you pull this random number out of the bag for this uniform distribution, you sense the channel, you get to count down that counter each time you sense the channel to be free. As soon as the channel becomes busy, you hold the previous count value till the next time. But you can only count down when you're in the green portion of your observation, not in the blue portion. So the poor device who's a class 1 device never gets to count down, so it never gets access. This is just a state transition diagram of what was pulled out of the spec. Basically, this is describing adaptivity in a flowchart. It's actually incorrect, even though it's in the regulations, which is kind of amusing. But to be fair on them, it is labeled informative rather than normative. But they made some errors, so these are the corrections if you're interested. It's just basically, if you really want to know more about this, you can go and pick up the regulations and very easily understand how this listen before talk process actually works, and it describes it in quite a lot of detail. The text is the actual definitive way of doing things. So ETSI LBE parameters, this is just a table to back up my previous discussion showing the timing diagrams of how this actually works. So these are the various values that you're allowed to use for the various parameters. So very quickly, the P0 parameter is the number of prioritization slots you have to observe for. CW min is the minimum number of random back-off observation slots that you are allowed to use. CW max is the maximum number of observation slots doing random back-off. And then once you've done that entire procedure, which is called listen before talk, you get to grab the channel for that amount of time, which is labeled COT. It's either 2, 4, or 6 milliseconds that you're allowed to transmit for. The rest is not really important details. But the long and the short of it is, you can substitute ETSI for LAA in this entire presentation that I've shown you so far, because 3GPP LAA has copied this verbatim, so it is entirely conforming to the ETSI specifications. So where does this lead us? Well, as I said, I was trying to explore coexistence. So, well, how do priority 1 through priority 4 devices coexist with each other? I'm hoping that the greens do show up. This is a pie graph of, imagine the amount of time that you were analyzing the channel for. That's the pie. And this is how it broke down as to which device got unencumbered access for that amount of time. So ETSI class 4 got more than half of the access. Running the regulation-defined procedure of listen before talk, class 4 got half the amount of time in total. The other 3 devices had to share the remains, with 10% colliding. If you both pull the same random number, you both try and transmit it exactly the same time, your transmissions are going to collide. And no one gets access at that point because you're just interfering with each other. So that's the orange portion that I'm showing. The CCA portion is doing the LBT procedure, the clear carrier access. So this is when no one's using the channel at all, everyone's just doing sensing. I split out the green and the yellow for class 2 and class 3 just to split out what is collided access versus what is uncollided access. If you remember from my previous slide, each priority class gets a different amount of time that it's allowed to grab the channel for. 6 milliseconds being the longest, 2 milliseconds being the shortest. So if 6 milliseconds collides with 2 milliseconds, you've still got 4 milliseconds of uncollided access. That's the shaded portion that I'm trying to show. In the instances where the device did collide with something else, it still got 4 out of 6 milliseconds of unencumbered access. Whether it can use that access or not is, I guess, up to the technology. But I'm trying to break it out to show that it did collide. It has a fraction of its transmission, which is still useful. So as you can see, class 1 got nothing. As I predicted from looking at the timing diagram, class 1 device is not going to compete well when there's class 3 or 4 class 3 or class 4 devices active. Now remember, IEEE labels these classes: background, best effort, video, and voice. So your background device, the device that's maybe doing a download of FTP access, if anything else is active, your download's going to stop. If there's any other device of higher priority. So, well, what does it look like when you put 2 priority classes next to each other of just priority 1 difference? So, class 3 versus class 4, class 2 versus class 3, or 1 versus 2. Well, the story is actually not that much better. In fact, in some cases, it's worse. The higher priority class will always win, and win substantially. So what about contention of the same device type? So here I put 8 devices in a simulation together, and they all got equal access. Great, but they also collided 37% of the time. And this was, by the way, a class 2 device, which IEEE will call best effort. Now, best effort to you is probably 90% of your internet traffic, unless you're a heavy video user. So Etsy, well, thanks to IEEE, have this thing called exponential backoff, where if you encounter a collision, you get to double your random window each time you pick a random number out of that uniform distribution. So exponential backoff does actually help. It reduces the collisions from 37 to 23%, but still, it's a sizable chunk of waste just for 8 devices. So I went a little bit further and simulated how much utilization you get from, say, 1 to 8 devices. And you can see the sort of aggregate utilization is dropping substantially as you move from 95% for 1 device, or actually 97%, I think, for 1 device, down to a little over 75% when you're out at 8 devices. So I took that to steroids. I said, well, what does it look like when we pile in 128 devices? And remember, this is now a simulation of 128 devices of one particular type. So it's either 128 class 1 devices, 128 class 2 devices, 128 class 3 devices, 128 class 4 devices. What's the aggregate utilization of those 128 devices when they're all competing against each other? And well, the utilization is pretty spectacularly bad. To the point when I would actually declare Etsy Adaptivity is fundamentally broken. I mean, are we happy with 20 devices competing with each other throwing away 70% of your bandwidth for class 3 and 4 devices. So I drew this another way. I looked at the amount of time between successful access. So I got my simulator to measure the mean times between successful access to the channel without any collision. And this is a graph again from one device out to 128 devices. And it gets pretty spectacularly bad. You know, it will take a class 4 device, worst case, 80 seconds between successful accesses to the channel. And on average, something like 10 seconds between successful accesses to the channel. Most of that is given away simply because it continuously collided with something else. Second last slide. So this is one simulation where I'm trying to nail it, probably with PileDriver. But this is a time domain plot of a single ETSI class 3 device, which IEEE, by the way, calls video, competing with 8 ETSI class 2 devices, which is best effort in IEEE's case. And this is a timing diagram. It doesn't really look like it, but the top 8 lines are the 8 best effort devices. The second last line is the class 3 device, the video device. And then the very last line at the bottom is the aggregate use of the channel. Is it really fair that your neighbor's YouTube habits will grab 44.34% of the channel while you and your 7 other neighbors have to fight for 33% of the remaining? Because that's what's going to happen in a crowded urban environment if everyone starts to use video and actually tag it as video when it gets sent to the AP. So what about 6 gigahertz? Well, the rulemaking procedure for 6 gigahertz is happening right now. It's likely probably already happening behind the scenes, though no one's actually written anything down yet. IEEE has already said that they want to take whatever's in 5 gigahertz, whatever's currently in the ETSI regulations, and just copy it straight over to 6 gigahertz and keep doing what we've been doing for the last 15 years. My assertion is that should not be allowed to continue. The spectrum is way too valuable to be used so incredibly inefficiently. The principle of fair access in everyone's mind, not just mine, is way too important. So we should really start considering some new adaptivity schemes that can waste less, be far less aggressive in terms of priority, and maybe even synchronize with each other. So some sort of a frame-based scheme. And to the academics in the room, well, this is a worthy topic for an MSc or a PhD. It's definitely happening right now, and it's pertinent to everybody in this room. That's it. Anybody have any questions? Oh, there's one here.
It's almost like karaoke. There we go.
Thank you. So you commented, this is more like of a comment actually, you mentioned earlier that you kind of treated the EDTs as kind of potentially a secondary factor. These are the energy detection thresholds that are being considered for both NRU and for the upcoming .11ax as well. You know, our simulations on the coexistence of NRU and Wi-Fi shows that this is a very important parameter. The performance, in particular the fairness between these coexisting systems, would be very much impacted by how you set the EDT for the other coexisting system. So I don't know if, you know, was it that based on some experiments or some simulations that you thought this is something not, this parameter is not a key parameter in the coexistence and fairness aspects that you're looking at?
I know, it's absolutely crucial. I would completely agree. However, if you're trying to look at probability of successful access to the channel based on the adaptivity procedure, not the energy thresholds, then you don't actually want to look at the energy thresholds. Because energy thresholds is all about how far away these actual devices are from each other, how much interference the devices can actually handle. I'm trying to get down at the baseline probability of a device getting successful access. So the other thing that I didn't mention is that in all of my simulations, it's full buffer assumed the entire time. So all of these devices are trying to transmit data all of the time, which again, a lot of people would argue that's not a realistic model. That's not a real world model. But again, I'm trying to get at the baseline probability based on the adaptivity parameters, not about a real world situation. So said another way, I'm trying to understand the odds of winning given a set of devices trying to compete with each other. If you start putting energy thresholds into that, then that's based on channel models, and that's based on distance and sort of propagation properties. That kind of clouds the baseline probability, if that answers your question.
Well, they are actually interdependent because, the EDT will also dictate how aggressive or otherwise a device is in accessing the channel. So setting it too high or too low will actually impact how often it's going to, assuming saturated traffic as you may have assumed, still it will impact how many opportunities a device, whether it's an NRU or Wi-Fi, is going to attempt to seize the channel. Not necessarily successfully so, but the attempt itself is dictated by this threshold.
The threshold is to determine whether you see access from somebody else. So in my simulation, I'm assuming that everyone sees everyone all of the time. So there's, if you play with those thresholds, you're actually going to see more collisions, not less collisions.
Yeah, I see. So everybody, there's no hidden terminals here.
No.
Any other questions? Yes, all the way in the back. David.
Hi. So I'm David Starowinski from Boston University. So first, thanks for a great talk.
Pleasure.
First comment about the analysis. I think there are models from the literature, like you may want, I could give you a reference to, but Giuseppe Bianchi did models, fixed point analysis for these types of models. So there are well-known models that you could use. The second one kind of joined.
Sorry, models for what?
For modeling the throughput and collision probability in those type of systems. They were developed for Wi-Fi, but it seems the system is very similar. Maybe there are some parameters that are somewhat different. And they do even actually model backoff as part of, it's part of the model as well. Second thing, I was also about the hidden node issue. I think the hidden node is critical in those things because all this listen before talk, if there are hidden nodes, that can be a major issue, and I think it cannot be disregarded. A last one, and I'm not sure if you have looked at that, but different devices, obviously depending on their channel, they can transmit at different bit rates. And that also has a big impact. And have you considered that? I mean, for instance, at Wi-Fi, you can go from 1 megabit up to 600 megabits per second. That's a huge impact. In fact, what has been shown is that if you do not take that into consideration, that can also lead to significant performance degradation.
Yeah, you're now getting into implementation aspects of the various radio access technologies. So what I'm measuring is successful airtime. So it's trying to be technology agnostic. So it doesn't matter whether it's an IEEE device or whether it's a 3GPP device or whether it's a microphone. It's, did it get access or not? That's written in the regulations as to the procedure as to what you should follow to get you to the point of getting access to the channel or not. How you then use the channel when you've got it whether you can handle interference from other users, because you're a hidden node, whether you can throttle on your rate to get a better chance of actually mitigating some of the interference, or if you have SNR concerns because you're far away from the AP. Those are all implementation aspects. That's no longer technology agnostic. So what I'm trying to look at is wearing the regulator's hat. What's fair? What defines fair access from the regulator's point of view? He doesn't care what kind of modem you're actually implementing. He only cares that you got a fair amount of airtime. And I completely agree with your point about the hidden known problem. It is important. But that is being proposed to be solved by other mechanisms which are outside of adaptivity. Sort of request to send and clear to send signals and things like that. That's kind of out of the scope of trying to work out what the fundamental probability of success of getting airtime or not is.
One last question from anyone? Yes, Mike?
So admittedly, this question is technology dependent, but do you know of any groups that have done experiments with SDRs, 10, 20, 50 SDRs together, and they try NR and Wi-Fi together, or LTE and Wi-Fi together to see what the actual access is? Or again, is that outside the scope of your investigation?
Yeah, MediaTek has done that. Okay. We're a Wi-Fi company. We're also a 3GPP company. The results that I came up with concur very, very favorably with what we simulate when we actually simulate full-blown LTE or Wi-Fi actually trying to coexist. But there you're talking about system-level simulators which are incredibly complicated and therefore incredibly slow. I'm simulating out to 128 devices. There's no ways you can do that with 128 devices. So you're not going to get that kind of curve from them. You might get it for 4 devices or 8 devices. This is not really going to tell you the full picture. I was astounded at this graph when I first saw it. I was literally shocked.
Okay, so with that, let's thank again Tim, Fisher, Jeffs.